This week, listeners, we're diving into a story that shocked travellers, disrupted flights, and raised major questions about energy resilience at Europe's busiest airports. I'm talking about the fire at the electrical substation on the edge of Heathrow, just outside London, which brought this international travel hub to a standstill. Exactly a week on from the fire itself, I travelled through the airport myself. It's a busy morning at Heathrow Airport. I'm standing outside Terminal 2, and I can see the usual mix of tourist and business travellers. Some rushing to their gates, others sauntering through the terminal without a care in the world. All heading to destinations all over the world. Completely unaware, and maybe even unaware, what happened a week ago. Last Friday, this airport, one of the busiest in the world, was forced to close its doors for a full 24 hours after a fire knocked out a power substation at North Hyde. Flights from India to Istanbul, from Toronto to Tallinn were affected. Many turned around or were redirected. The airport was forced to close. With thousands of passengers stranded, the city's largest transport hub came to a standstill. But today, it's a return to normal. The flights are taking off, the terminals are bustling with activity. Power is back, planes are in the air and taxiing across the runway. But this air of normality masks some very serious questions that Heathrow, the UK TSO and the British government have. Hello listeners and welcome to Plugged In, the energy news podcast from Montel. Each week we bring you in-depth analysis and insights from across the energy sector. I'm Richard Sverrisson. I'm back in our Oslo studio and thankfully power was restored at Heathrow. Now, helping me to answer key questions about the outage at Heathrow and much more is Simon Gallagher, Managing Director at UK Network Services. Welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Thank you for having me.
So if we could start by just setting the scene a bit, really. I think Heathrow, how much power does it consume and where does that power come from?
Heathrow has a peak demand of about 40 megawatts, and it's actually fed from three different, what we call grid supply points in the UK. So in theory, each one of those can actually supply Heathrow all by itself. So one of those grid supply points did have a fault, and we've seen it spectacularly on the news with the transformer fire. So we can get into what happened there, but effectively, one of the grid supply points failed, and then Heathrow shut down operations.
Sure, we'll get to the details about that in a second, Simon. But what, in terms of backup, what does Heathrow have in terms of backup? Does it have own site generation as well?
Well, they have these three independent supplies, in theory, which in itself is a level of resilience. But it appears, now I don't know the ins and outs of inside the airport, but it appears they have backup for their critical safety systems. So they have backup for the runway lights, air traffic control, radio systems, the landing system. So safety was never compromised because all them things stayed up. But there's two important points to that. The first is that with these safety critical systems, once you go on to your backups, you then have no further backup. So actually, you can't use them. They're there for emergencies. And the wider airport did not have generation backup. So while in theory their safety critical systems were running, nothing else was operating. So the terminals were shut, the baggage handling systems were shut, and that's ultimately what forced them to shut down.
So if we can go back to what actually happened. So there was a fire at a substation, the North Hyde substation, early in the hours on Friday, was it? Friday the 20th of March?
Yeah, I think it actually started at around 11 o'clock the night before, where that substation called North Hyde, it's fed from another substation called Ivor in West London. So it's got two 275,000 volt circuits run to North Hyde. And in North Hyde, there's three transformers there, 275 to 66. One of the transformers went on fire. It failed. So, I mean, failed transformers is a thing that happens. Generally, they trip out fast and they don't spectacularly fail. But in this case, unfortunately, one of the transformers failed. It went on fire. And of course, there's 20,000 litres of oil within this transformer. It went on fire, which was actually, and it's environmentally, it's terrible, but from an electricity point of view, the national grid can cope with that. So with one transformer failed, the grid actually carried on fine. It maintained supplies. But unfortunately, right next to that transformer that went on fire is a second transformer that got damaged in the heat. It's too close to be able to maintain supply. So the second transformer also failed because it got damaged in the fire. And that was the stage then where National Grid could not then maintain supply. So there's about 60,000 customers connected to that substation. They all lost supply at that point, including Heathrow Airport.
But there's nothing suspicious about the fire. It was just something that's one of these things that, unfortunately does occur now and again.
Yeah, there's nothing. I mean, you'll have seen the news reports originally was, is this sabotage or is there a state actor involved? No, it just looks like an equipment failure.
But you said that 60,000 people were cut off, but their power was restored fairly quickly.
Yeah, so the distribution network operator in the area, Scottish and Southern Electricity Network, so they then started rearranging their high voltage networks to use supplies from other places. So SSEN were able to reconfigure their network to get supplies back on, but the bit of Heathrow that was off, that was a 20 megawatt chunk. That's quite a big bit to try and pick up on the network when you've lost one of your grid supply points.
So there was enough power to supply, those 60,000, and Scottish and Southern managed to restore the supply there. Why was that not the case for Heathrow? Because you said 20 megawatts is obviously much higher than 60,000 customers, their consumption.
Yeah, so SSE were able to split their network up and reconfigure things. So now we don't know. Ultimately, it took them all day to restore all the customer supplies in the area. So what we don't know at this stage is, did they manage to restore it without Hyde coming back on, or did they restore bits of Hyde? We don't know. But with Heathrow, yes, it's a big chunk to try and pick up elsewhere. But the real question for Heathrow is, you have a high voltage network on site that's connected to these 3 different supply points. Why is it when one failed, you weren't able to reconfigure things? So, and I do have sympathy here in that it does take time to reconfigure high voltage networks, and we don't really know what the design of that network is. So there may be design limitations, there may be hardware limitations. We don't quite know, but I think it's a fair question to ask. Why could that network not be reconfigured relatively quickly to take supply from these other places?
I mean, this is one of Europe's biggest transport hubs, if not the biggest, and so it's quite a small outage affecting two transformers, if I understood you correctly there, Simon. So, but it raises some serious concerns about the UK's energy security and the resilience of the network. So, I mean, how would you gauge the significance of what happened on Friday?
It's massively significant because it affected Heathrow, one of the world's largest airports. But if this had not have affected Heathrow, it would be a regional news story. 60,000 customers is a tragedy for the people who are involved, of course. But 60,000 customers is not a huge amount of people to lose supply in the grand scheme of things. We lose far more in storms. But of course, Heathrow is protected, which raises 2 big questions. It raises the question I mentioned about why couldn't Heathrow reconfigure themselves? Because in theory, they have a secure supply because they've got these 3 independent in-feeds. But also, why does Heathrow not have a lot of generation backup? So if we compare Heathrow to some other industries, and not just Heathrow, by the way, but all airports in the UK. So right next to Heathrow, in fact, within 20 meters of the fence of the substation where the fire happened, there's a brand new data center. And that data center will ultimately consume 150 megawatts. So 3-4 times what Heathrow consumes. Now, the first data hall has opened on that data center, and that's about 30 megawatts. And that's connected via 66,000 volt cables to North Hyde, the exact same substation. But the big difference in that data center and Heathrow is the data center has got 100% generation backup. So they've actually got 12 Rolls-Royce large generators, a couple, I think they're 3 megawatts each. So in the event of a fault, and this did happen, the FT reported this, that the data center seen the same loss of supply, but their backup systems kicked in instantly. The generators fired up. They never lost operations. And even to the extent that they've got 12 generators, but they only actually need 11. One of them's there to back up the backups. So it's a fair question to ask. Well, if a data center can protect itself so well, you cannot say this data center was more important than Heathrow. So there's definitely broader questions around how is resilience handled by the airport industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Heathrow is a household name, whereas this data center is probably known by very few, maybe the technical data nerds, Simon. But how come they were able to provide this backup, but Heathrow wasn't? I mean, I think and you were talking 11, 12, backup generators. I presume they're gas fired or diesel.
Diesel in this case.
Yeah. So, I mean, does that raise questions about Heathrow and other maybe UK airports that they should put in place measures to provide that kind of backup? What are your views here?
Yeah, I think it does. Like most airports in the UK don't even have this level of resilience that Heathrow does. So Heathrow's got these 3 GSPs. Most other airports don't have that. I think what's happened is the airports are a more mature industry, so things have changed over time. So the airports are probably more critical to business and daily life than was 20 years ago. Whereas the data centers are a new, young industry. I think they're more attuned right now to what is the impact if they lose their operations, which is catastrophic for their business models, but also catastrophic for their customers in terms of they would feel as well. So the data center seems to have done the cost-benefit analysis that it's worth spending and it is millions of pounds on generators. It's worth spending this millions of pounds to guard against an exceptionally rare event, which is what this power loss is. They have made the business case that it's worth doing that, whereas I don't think the airports have actively not done that. It's just that things have changed over time, and now that needs re-looked at again.
I mean, there's sort of legacy industry versus quite a modern, up-to-date kind of. There's those two, the two ways of looking at it. Would that be fair, son?
I think that's exactly what's happened. We've got a legacy, mature industry with a different take now on what's a younger industry.
And I think, you would expect then to see such backup solutions being introduced, not just at Heathrow, but other airports. If you're talking, they needn't be diesel generators, but they could also be battery backups, couldn't they? I mean, that would be perfectly possible in these kind of scenarios, would it not?
Well, you have to have both, really. So those data centers have got UPSs because the generators take a few minutes to spin up. So you have to bridge that gap. So
UPS, Simon, could you explain that to?
Uninterruptible.
Okay.
Uninterruptible power supply. So basically, the data center's fed via batteries, so that if the grid fails, the batteries can maintain the full supply for a few minutes while the generators kick in.
Gotcha. But I think, with data centers, you mentioned, it's catastrophic if they go down. I mean, heaven forbid we have to, ChatGPT goes down or you stop mining Bitcoin. But of course, they have other much more, important, ways of other customers. But but losing or disruption to, what was it, 250,000 passengers, that's also quite catastrophic. It's certainly an embarrassment, and if not catastrophic for Heathrow.
Undoubtedly. But I think there's two schools of thought here, in that if you look at the data center, so their critical loads they are serious. So it's like financial institutions. It could be trades worth billions of pounds flowing between the London Stock Exchange and New York Stock Exchange. So that's the kind of things that presumably their collateral exposure is huge if any of that fails. With the data center, they probably have huge contractual penalties if they fail, like business ending type costs. But there's an argument that says, the airports, so if Heathrow fails, a lot of the financial cost is actually externalized. So with the Heathrow failures, probably the airlines who are bearing the brunt of the financial penalties rather than Heathrow. So there might be a slightly different incentive for the data centers over Heathrow, but regardless of the actual pound note cost at the end of the day, I think the airports will have to be more resilient after what's happened.
Yep, and I think you have the airlines, and certainly the representatives of the airlines or the Association of Airlines were the most critical in their voices on that Friday and the subsequent days, weren't they? I mean, but is there a vulnerability here at airports that could be the case elsewhere in Europe as well, not just in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, the UK is not special in this regard. So Schiphol had problems back in 2018 where they actually seen high voltage fluctuations on their high voltage power supplies, and they actually went off as well. So Schiphol had these big problems. They didn't have enough generation to back up their terminals either. But since that, they have put in more generation now, and they actually test it quite regularly. So they will actually switch their terminals off from the main supply while they're in operation. So not just a theory thing, they will actually turn their terminals off to test their backup systems while the airport's open during the day. And then if we look internationally, Dubai, for example, because this is what Heathrow needs to be compared to, really, it's big international hub airports. So Dubai International, they've actually got 3 independent grid supply point feeds as well. And then they have extensive on-site generation, more akin to the data centers in the UK.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think also in the aftermath of the incident, you heard from the CEO of the National Grid saying that there was power was available, even if the airport was not tapping into it. What are your thoughts here, Simon?
Well, that goes back to that point that, and it is right that they did. So they've got these 3 different independent supplies from 3 different substations, 3 different grid supply points, and the point that the CEO of National Grid is making was, we definitely had a problem. We lost one of our supplies to you, but you had 2 still live, which had the capacity to feed your airport. So why did it take you 18 hours to get yourself back online? And this goes to this question about why did it take so long to reconfigure your 11,000 volt network on site? And there may be multiple answers for that. Like I said at the start, it may not be configured to do that. There may be design limitations we don't know at this stage.
And now there's a probe or an investigation into the issue, so we'll probably have to wait to sort of 6 weeks or more to find out what actually happened. But is there a wider concern about the vulnerability of the UK's energy infrastructure here? Does it raise not just the airports or data centres, but maybe more and more capacity is coming online, and both in forms of the kind of generators you mentioned, batteries, and also production sites with offshore wind or onshore solar. What does this say about the grid in the UK? Is it at straining point?
I think we need to be careful when we look into a rare one-off. We call these high-impact, low-probability events when these happen. And every few years, there's one of these. So in my own career, in the company I used to work for, we lost 4 132 kV oil-filled cables over a cable bridge in South London, and that took out South London for a while. There's multiple of these things happen, but what it shows to me is that they are very rare events, and they do usually expose some unknown thing. But if you take a step back and look at the UK as a whole, we have got some of the most reliable electricity networks on the planet. So if you look at the UK's average outage per person in the UK, it's very low. If you look at the UK's average duration of fault per person in the UK, it's very low. When I started sort of 20 years ago, we used to have an average, every person in the UK had no power for about 100 minutes on average, 120 minutes. Now in London, it's less than 30. So the UK is actually very reliable. But when you have an issue that affects a big customer, a big important thing like Heathrow, of course that then needs a very close look.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the it's important to remind ourselves that this is a very, very rare event. But of course, it is quite dramatic when it affects an international airport of the size and reputation of Heathrow. But I mean, we mentioned in the introduction a little bit, Simon, when we just started chatting before we started recording about state actors or involvement of state actors here, and there was a suspicion there, but that's obviously not happened in this case. But if I were a malevolent state actor or wishing to disrupt the energy infrastructure, would I look at this and think, I just need to get, attack these kind of transformers or these substations because they're vulnerable to that kind of attack?
Well, I think that the vulnerability of any country's power system is well known. So it's not anyone who would be thinking about attacking the UK's power system already knows that it could be attacked and where the weak points are, just like every other country. And it wouldn't, if you asked me to look at a third country and say, where's the weak points here? All you need is Google Maps to have a look around. So yes, there's vulnerability. I would say the UK has done quite a lot to guard itself against this, but probably not one to go into in a podcast. But there is a lot of security now to prevent a lot of these things happening.
Absolutely, and we see with certain interconnectors between cold countries, certainly in the Baltic countries, that's also highlighted some of the vulnerabilities here with some of the infrastructure. But you mentioned data centers, and that's the data centers there close to Heathrow. Is this, what's the outlook for data centers in the UK, and what impact could they have on the grid?
We are seeing a huge demand for data centers now. So data centers a few years ago were sort of 20, 30 megawatts was a big data center. The one that just connected next to Heathrow is 150 megawatts, which is huge.
Yeah.
We're actually working on one at the minute that's 300 megawatts. So, that's a UK city. So, and actually, when we talk about the transmission system, National Grid's 400 kV and 275 kV, and Scottish Power in Scotland and SSEN of Scotland, a direct connection to those networks for demand was actually unheard of until recently, whereas now these data centers are connecting directly to the transmission network. So there is a huge demand for them right now, yes. And
how does this relate to the issue of zonal versus national pricing as well? Because if you had, you mentioned this data center close to, it's on the outskirts of London, but surely if all the data centers were around London, the grid would be put under an impossible strain. I mean, in Ireland, Dublin has forbidden more data centers around Dublin. So, could that situation arise in the UK, do you think, Simon?
Well, I mean, we are seeing that situation. So Slough in West London has got the highest concentration of data centers in Europe, mostly because it sits on the transatlantic fibre networks from the City of London to New York. So we're already seeing that in that the driver of data centers does seem to be heavily focused on London, because you do have ex-industrial sites. Like you've got the old power station sites that in theory have a huge big demand connection available. But, and I'm not a comms person, but for a communications point of view, they want to be around London. Now that is changing a bit. People tell me that with age, AI, you don't need to be so close to London, but currently we do see a definitely a favour of London for these data centres, which is why the power problems in West London, the capacity constraints there are quite well known and publicised.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the arguments for zonal pricing is to have lower prices, say in the north, in Scotland, where to attract this kind of infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of the jury's out with me on zonal pricing, because I can totally understand why. Yeah, well, let's use price and signal to attract industry to those areas where we have the infrastructure and the capacity. But at the same time, if I owned a factory that happened to be in a place where it's now expensive, why is that fair on me and the people who I employ? All of a sudden, I can't do anything about relocating my factory right now. So there's, like all these things, there's winners and losers, and we just need to be careful which has got the biggest societal benefit.
Absolutely. The devil is always in the detail there, Simon. I mean, thank you, Simon, for a fascinating discussion. I think it's clear it was quite an embarrassment to the UK government, but I think it's very good to get an overview of what actually happened and what led to that outage. So thank you for clarifying that, Simon.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
It's been an excellent and insightful discussion. I hope you agree, listeners. And thank you for tuning in to this episode. Our podcast episodes are released every Friday. For the latest news from Montel, please visit montelnews.com, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and other social media channels. See you next time.